Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Mann Stott, and tonight we're starting the show as we have been for the last couple of months, reminding everyone that I stand with the people of Ukraine, and the organization I want to highlight tonight is called Insight Ukraine, which is a Ukrainian LGBTQ rights advocacy organization, but right now they are doing work to help support gay, lesbian, and trans Ukrainian citizens during the war. So I'll post the link to their website where you can make a donation if you so wish to help the people of Ukraine through this unspeakable time. Okay, so tonight we are solidly in the time of Taurus. Last week we were on the cusp, but now we are in Taurus. And in fact, there are many heavy-hitting Taurus directors. My unscientific research has indicated to me that Taurus is a sign that sort of lends itself to filmmaking and actually artist work of any media. So in terms of Taurus directors, we have Frank Capra, Max Ophuls, and Roberto Rossellini, who made three of the most important neo-realist films out of Italy, Paisan, Rome Open City, and Germany Year Zero. If you haven't seen those movies, I cannot recommend them highly enough. Then we have Fred Zinnemann. Orson Welles was a Taurus, and Satyajit Ray, who was a filmmaker in India in the 50s and 60s. Meatball has something to say about Taurus film directors. Meatball, if you want to say it, you need to come in here and participate and not yell from out there. So Satyajit Ray was an Indian filmmaker working from the 50s through, I think, the 70s or 80s. And he's most famous for the Apu trilogy, which had a huge impact on filmmaking around the world. Elaine May is a Taurus, Claire Denis, one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Most intense filmmakers working today is a Taurus. Jane Campion, who we celebrated on the first Real Takes, is a Taurus. Oscar Farhadi is a Taurus. John Cameron Mitchell, who directed Hedwig and the Angry Inch, a big favorite of mine, is a Taurus. So just lots of Taurus filmmakers to talk about. And we will get into films from some Taurus directors in the weeks to come. But tonight, we're doing another actor celebration because it was Al Pacino's birthday this week. And Al Pacino gave two of my all-time favorite acting performances in two of my all-time favorite films of all time. So I have to talk about him. So happy birthday, Al Pacino, Taurus. And, you know, Al Pacino's kind of thought of, I think, in one of two ways. The way some people sort of think of him now is with these kind of big performances that he gave in movies like Scarface or The Devil's Advocate. And then if you're into film at all, you immediately know that he is almost synonymous with the sort of 70s gritty New York City film, which you all know is one of my favorite genres of film. But before all of that, he was a theater actor. Al Pacino was actually born and raised in New York City, and he joined the Actors Studio in 1966. He studied with Lee Strasberg, who was the main teacher of the method, which is so overused as a term now to be like completely misunderstood, but was a very intense method of using one's own sense memory to inform what emotion you bring to your parts, and was a big movement in the United States in the 50s and 60s, and informed a lot of the acting work that we associate with sort of the 70s gritty, more realist American cinema. So he was studying in theater. He had some very lean years where he slept on friends' couches and needed to borrow money for bus fare to get to auditions, but he ultimately had some success and won an Obie and a Tony before he started making films. So wow, Meatball is making a lot of noise. I'm gonna go take care of that because it's distracting me. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's distracting me. So I'm gonna go deal and come back. Okay, so I'm back. It's much nicer when Trudy just comes and sits on my lap, right? Than Al Pacino begging for food. Meatball begging for food. So where were we? So Al Pacino was working in New York as an actor. He'd won an Obie and a Tony, and he started making films. His earliest lead role is a movie called The Panic in Needle Park, which is a devastating look at drug addiction on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the early 70s. And then he famously got cast in The Godfather. It's important to note that the only person who wanted to cast him in The Godfather was Francis Ford Coppola. The studio wanted anyone but Al Pacino, including they pushed hard for Ryan O'Neal to star in The Godfather, but Francis Ford Coppola fought for him and he got the role, and that kind of exploded him into stardom. He then made Serpico and The Godfather Part 2, and so at this point he's, Oscar nominated several times over. When we get to the first film we're talking tonight, which is Dog Day Afternoon, which came out in 1975, was directed by Sidney Lumet and co-stars Charles Durning, John Cazale, Penelope Allen, Carol Kane, and Chris Sarandon, actually. So, and I want to mention that this one was edited by Dee Dee Allen, who had a huge multi-decade editing career. She edited The Hustler and Bonnie and Clyde. She edited several Sidney Lumet films across the 70s and worked into the 80s, including on The Breakfast Club, which I didn't know until I was researching for this film. And when I rewatched it last night in preparation for today, I was really taking in the editing work. So Dog Day Afternoon is based on a true story. It's actually the script was written off of a magazine article called The Boys in the Bank, because it's a true story about a bank robbery that two men committed on an August day in Brooklyn in 1972. And this is a teeny bit of a spoiler. What I'm about to say verges on spoiler territory, because this plot twist is not introduced until like an hour into the film. Doesn't tell you how things end. But it's a big plot point, and part of the reason I love this film is because of this plot point. So I'm gonna spill it if you don't know it. They rob the bank because Al Pacino's character needs to raise money to pay for his lover's sex change operation. So they rob this bank and it goes very wrong. I won't get into the details of how it goes wrong, but it goes very wrong. It was a true story, and Sidney Lumet made it into a movie. Now, this movie is at the heart of 70s gritty New York City dramas. The film opens with these big wide shots of New York and then close-ups of dogs eating garbage and, just the way New York City looked in the 1970s. And in fact, the only time there's music or scoring in the film at all is over the opening credits. There's an Elton John song playing that gets transitioned as the credits end into the song playing on the radio in the car with Al Pacino and John Cazale. And after that, there is no music in the film that a character isn't playing or hearing. So Sidney Lumet really wanted to embrace as much realism as he could within the context of, narrative filmmaking. Since this story really did happen, these people really existed. He did an extensive rehearsal process, which he always liked. And he let the actors improvise more than he usually does. I've read and heard him talk about the fact that he wasn't usually all that interested in improvisation in his filmmaking, because he feels like if you have a good screenwriter who's worked really hard on a script, in his experience, it was rare that actors in a moment come up with a line that's better than what's in the script. But because of the way that the bank workers and Al Pacino and John Cazale had to bond for the film, he realized in rehearsal that some improvisation could be helpful, and the screenwriter was there, and he actually took some of those lines and put them in the script. There are a few little places in the film where during filming they also improvise, but not many. And he also encouraged them all to wear their own clothes for the shoot, and they didn't use almost any extra lighting. Hi, Meatball. Are you ready to constructively join the conversation? Yes, like by being on my lap. That's so much more constructive than yelling at me for food. Yes. Are you going to chill out now? Oh, that's good. And they also shot mostly in sequence. Sidney Lumet was adamant that he didn't want to do the interiors on a soundstage, and they found a block in Brooklyn where they could shoot on the street. There was a warehouse where they could build out the bank, and then across the street there was a building that they could use as the barbershop where the police had set up their headquarters. And what they did was they shot all the externals in sequence, and then they shot all the bank scenes in sequence. So another story that I forgot to put in here is there's a moment in the film when Al Pacino has to make two really emotionally difficult phone calls in a row, and Sidney Lumet wanted to shoot them without any cuts in sequence, and that was more time than a roll of film had on it. I think rolls of film had 10 minutes on them, and the two phone calls together were going to be more than 10 minutes. So Sidney Lumet set up two cameras, and when one came to the end of its reel, they just went right to the next one so that they could shoot both phone calls in sequence without any break, and, get that sort of real experience of Al Pacino's emotional arc with these two phone calls. And so they set this all up, and they did one take, and Sidney Lumet has said that it was brilliant, and a director could never ask for more, better, anything different than what Al Pacino gave on the first take. But something inside him, Sidney Lumet, just said, "That was great, Al, but we want to do it one more time." And he doesn't know why he said that, but he just did. And Al Pacino didn't break character, but looked up at him and looked so devastated and, completely deflated, and then just went into it and did it again. And they had, kept rolling with the run reel and then set up another reel, and they just kept going. And he did it a second time. And Sidney Lumet said it was just as good, but his emotional exhaustion from having done it the first time and having to do it a second time was even better. And so they used the second take, but they used him looking at Sidney Lumet when he says, "We have to do it again," at the end of the second take, because obviously they're intercutting between Al Pacino and whoever he's on the phone with. They use that look at the end of all of it because Al Pacino didn't break character, so they could just take that look of him just being so deflated and exhausted and kind of heartbroken that he had to do it again and put it at the end of the take. So I just love that story because it's, that commitment to the realism and creating the space to really have the experience, but then also using, your instinct and the happy or unhappy accident of, this moment between the director and the actor sort of feeding the film. Okay. So I love this film for a bunch of reasons. One, I love 70s gritty New York City dramas in general. And it's, just such a finely crafted piece of cinema, on every level. But one of the things I really appreciate about this film is that in 1975, there weren't that many mainstream films with gay or queer or trans characters in them. And when those characters were in, for instance, classic cinema, first of all, they were heavily coded. You couldn't name any of it, and they were usually degenerate in some way or evil in some way, and they usually were murdered. And then when I first saw this movie in my early 20s, so this would be the early mid 90s, the few mainstream films I had seen with gay characters had so much, I don't know what the right word is, like discomfort in them. Like you could feel that the actors were uncomfortable making the movie. You could feel that no one on the set understood, gay desire or, community or anything, that it was Oh, so there's so much to talk about here. So first of all, I want to say that the early 90s were actually a very exciting time for gay and queer filmmaking. And that period is sometimes now referred to as new queer cinema, a phrase that B. Ruby Rich coined, or the queer new wave. It was the first time there were like a whole handful of gay filmmakers making their own work and finding their audience. So, Todd Haynes, Pedro Almodovar, Gus Van Sant, Lisa Cholodenko, Cheryl Dunye were suddenly all making narrative feature films, finding the money to make them, albeit, very down and dirty sometimes, totally indie, but narrative filmmaking. So it was actually a really exciting time for cinema that way. And of course, in the 80s, there were some great movies, like The Exceptions Prove the Rule. So Maurice was a beautiful movie that Merchant Ivory made, based on the E.M. Forster novel. My Beautiful Laundrette by Stephen Frears was groundbreaking. Desert Hearts was groundbreaking, by Donna Deitch. Personal Best was groundbreaking by John Sayles. So, there were better films and representations starting to happen in the 80s, but it was still, a drop in the bucket compared to, the overwhelming amount of, lack of representation, but then also horrible representation from classic cinema. So anything still felt like a really special moment. It's hard to convey how different that moment was. It's easy to forget. So any kind of representation still felt important and special. And to see this movie from the 70s that treated the homosexuality and the transsexuality in the film really matter-of-factly. The movie wasn't only about that. They didn't reduce the characters to just that, and yet they didn't hide or code or cover up what was going on in any way. Al Pacino's character never shrinks from that part of himself, and they're very matter-of-fact about the homophobia and transphobia and people's discomfort around them as well. So it's not like it's a fake portrait. It feels very real and grounded in a way that was unusual in its time. And it was also unusual to have a major movie star, a major mainstream movie star playing a gay character who obviously is in a desperate situation and not making the best possible decisions for himself. But within that was a full and complete character who had a lot of agency and, was really compelling. So, and also I've read that Chris Sarandon, who played Al Pacino's lover, did a lot of research, spent time with some transsexual people to kind of get more information and connect and work through his own stuff. And the film, there were gay rights protesters who showed up at the site of the robbery during the day because the whole media spectacle played out over 12 hours or something. So there were gay rights activists who showed up in real life. And so they reached out to gay rights activists and had them be extras showing up. So there was just a big effort to be respectful in a way that was very unusual for a movie by, a huge Hollywood director starring huge Hollywood stars. So it was radical. And then Al Pacino's performance itself. Really radical to see Al Pacino, who, was at that time growing. And by the time I watched this movie, had this incredible reputation as this sort of American, masculine energy, bring all of that energy to this film and not hold himself back from that or not put anything on. He didn't do any kind of stereotyping of being gay and he didn't hold back all of his intense focus and energy from the role at all. And that was a kind of portrayal of a gay character that I had never seen in a mainstream film at the time. And I have been told by my elders that in the gay community, this movie had a very mixed reception because, he robs a bank for his lover. His lover is mentally unstable. There's a whole conflation of gay and trans identities here that we now have a lot more language for that was kind of mixed up. And so, there were gay people and factions of the gay community that were critical of this film because there were no other films. So there was no kind of, it's not like this was one film among many about gay people. It was like, there was this film. But for me, seeing it in the early 90s, it felt really radical. And I've heard Sidney Lumet talk about, Sidney Lumet was straight. Probably almost everyone who worked on the picture was straight. But I've heard him talk about how much they worked to kind of keep everybody's humanity intact in the film and treat everyone's journey with total respect. And I feel that in the movie. And so it kind of blew me away when I first saw it and stayed with me and has always stayed with me. Al Pacino's energy at the time was so powerful on screen, and he had all this craft and sophistication around character in his performance, and then he just had this passion that was kind of pouring out of him. He did do one thing that, he might have done many things, but one thing he did in his research was he had noticed that in the early 70s in New York City, lots of gay men had big mustaches. And so he'd grown a mustache for the shoot. And then apparently Sidney Lumet hated it even before they started shooting, but they shot a day of it and then they both agreed it looked awful on him and had to go. So he shaved it and they lost a day of shooting because they had to scrap all of that and do it again. But there's so many great acting stories about this movie. Penelope Allen, who plays the head teller of the bank, she and Al Pacino were close. She and her husband had actually let Al Pacino crash in their apartment when he was struggling in the 60s. And then John Cazale and Al Pacino were really close. They'd obviously done The Godfather together, but before that they had done theater together. And there are just some lovely, lovely interviews with Al Pacino talking about his respect for John Cazale and how much he could bring to his performances. And he said they just loved each other and they wanted to work together all the time. He said they were sort of like the high school kids that need to be separated. Like they just wanted to like make work and improvise and play together all the time. And so there's just a lot of dedication to craft and to acting and filmmaking in this film. And I think you can feel it all. So Dog Day Afternoon, if you haven't seen it, please see it. But the next film we're going to talk about 24 years later is The Insider, which came out in 1999. It was directed by Michael Mann and co-starred Russell Crowe, Christopher Plummer, Diane Venora, Lindsay Krause, Philip Baker Hall, Michael Gambon, and kind of the list goes on with the supporting actors in this film. It's just an incredible cast. And I never put this together until I was getting ready to do this show, that this film is also based on a true story, also was built off a magazine article. And I'm of the opinion that magazine articles and short stories are actually great source material for movies, because sometimes big, great novels, even though they have wonderful material, there's just so much going on, and it's really hard when you come to distilling down for a film what to cut, what to keep. It can get unwieldy, whereas a magazine article with some great characters and a great story, or a short story, can really translate to that like 2 to 3 hour storytelling window really well. So The Insider is the true story of Jeffrey Wigand, who was the head of research and development at Brown and Williamson and ended up blowing the whistle on them. And Lowell Bergman, played by Al Pacino, who was a producer at 60 Minutes, who met Jeffrey Wigand, and they ultimately worked toward Jeffrey Wigand doing an interview on 60 Minutes. So again, kind of some spoilers here, but this isn't a spoiler. Cigarettes are bad for you. But this is not a moralistic tale, and in fact, Michael Mann has said in interviews he smoked all through the writing of this script with Eric Roth, so he has no moralism about smoking or not smoking. But it's a story about power and corporate power, and I think it's really a character study within a sort of political corporate thriller. That's my take on it. I love this movie so much, and it's so much about power and how we respond when we come up against, the misuse of power or the corrupt use of power, and what we have to find in ourselves to maintain our integrity within those situations. So Jeffrey Wigand is clearly a complicated personality, and Lowell Bergman is clearly a, forceful personality who doesn't compromise very much. And part of the great tension of this film is that they don't become buddies or pals. They're not a match made in heaven. They're actually two very different people who kind of, work their way around each other because they realize they each have something the other needs. And so they kind of find a way to work together. So the truth is, this, even though the movie is very suspenseful for me, but it's not so much, where we get to, it's how we get there and how these two people kind of butted up against each other. And Al Pacino and Russell Crowe are like at the top of their game. And part of why I like pairing these two films, Dog Day Afternoon and The Insider, is that I feel like Dog Day Afternoon, even though Al Pacino was in his early 30s when he made Dog Day Afternoon, but it was very early in his movie career, and he still had this some kind of youthful, intense energy about him. And this is 25 years later, and I feel like we get all the craft that Al Pacino always has, and all the sophistication and the sort of thinking person's performance, and yet there's this kind of seasoned layer that is about, the fact that he worked for 25 more years and lived for 25 more years, and somehow all of that kind of filters into the performance in a way that I really love. I hesitate to call it a later performance because Al Pacino's still been working for the last 20 years and turned in some other, incredible performances. Insomnia is a great movie. He played Roy Cohn in the Mike Nichols version of Angels in America brilliantly. He's done theater work. He's done Oscar Wilde. Like he's working so for 20 more years. So it was a mid to late career performance, but just an incredibly sophisticated, nuanced, tempered performance of his. And it's a Michael Mann film, and it has the kind of mood that Michael Mann brings to his cinemas that's okay. So yeah, Michael Mann's interesting, right? And I feel like he really crystallized something about his style on this film. There's like a muted intensity, like a sort of simmering intensity to the film, and then there are these touches of like subtly hyper realist visual moments. He also plays with the timeline a couple of times in ways that are really effective. So he's just like dropping in these little cinematic touches of artistry, either visual or So I just wanted to mention also pace in all of this. I think, an easy way to create pace in film is to keep things moving and sort of jump us in and out of situations, is a way to create like a certain kind of intensity. But this film goes the opposite direction and kind of slows us down so that the way we come in and out of moments is really creative, and we're kind of held in a certain pace as we deal with these conflictual situations, and it creates a lot of tension for me. And even watching the opening credits this time around, I was so struck by how they were handled. Like the screen's black, some music comes in, some sort of ambient, probably organ, I don't know what else, comes in, creating a mood. Then the sound of where we are comes in, but we can't see where we are. So the sounds are familiar, but we're still disoriented. And then the picture comes in, but the picture's so close up that we can't identify what's actually happening right away. So that kind of layering of all the different elements of cinema work to, for me, like pull me in rather than reaching out and grabbing me. Like I'm like, wait, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? Where are we? I'm like actively engaging with what's happening, and he maintains that level of interest and engagement while developing the story at a very like studied, careful rate. And that tension between the pace and how information is delivered keeps me really engaged. We're now jumping back to my original jumping in. Michael Mann had a great run, like in the late 90s and early aughts. He had made The Last of the Mohicans, and then he had made, with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, Heat a few years before. So they had a working relationship already. And then after this, he made Ali, the biopic about Muhammad Ali starring Will Smith, and he also made Collateral. So there was a real run there of great pictures. I just love this film, both of these films, obviously, and so many other Al Pacino movies. And actually, in researching this, I realized that there are a couple of Al Pacino performances I still haven't seen that I'm gonna start watching now. So tell me in the comments what your favorite Al Pacino performance is, and let me know what you think of these movies. I am just so grateful. I have revisited these movies so many times in my life, and the work here, the commitment and the courage and the focus that he brought to these roles just moves me every time. So thank you so much, Al Pacino, for your beautiful work, and please see these movies if you haven't seen them, and I will see you next Wednesday. Right, Meatball? Right? Will you see everyone next Wednesday? Huh? Say goodbye. Say goodbye. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.